So the title of my presentation is Cybernetics and Communism, Cybernetic Thinking in the Polish People's Republic. First of all, I would like to thank UKOI and the Media Lab Guangdong Times Museum for inviting me to participate in this series of lectures. I am very indebted by this invitation and happy to offer my modest contribution to this fascinating discussion that you have launched. I had been asked to talk about the history of cybernetics in Poland, and I am going to do so, although I am neither a historian nor a specialist in cybernetics specifically. My field of research in general terms can be defined as continental philosophy of technology, and I tend to address the question concerning technology as strictly related to politics and political economy. From this perspective, the cybernetic moment in Poland, and more specifically in the Polish People's Republic, can be instructive because it shows the interdependence of science, politics, and ideology in this particular context of what was referred to as scientific socialism at that time. The Polish People's Republic, just to recall some basic historical facts, was a socialist one-party state with a unitary Marxist-Leninist government headed by the Polish United Workers' Party. The country existed from 1947 to 1989 and was a satellite country in the Soviet sphere of interest. The goal of my talk is twofold. First, to ask about what we can learn from the Polish communist adventure of cybernetics in relation to the technological becoming of the world that we are all experiencing now on a planetary level. Second, to put an emphasis on the relation between cybernetics, dialectical materialism, and ideology in that particular political context. In fact, if cybernetics, historically speaking, can be considered a new science of machines, which launched a new understanding of the relation between the machinic and the organic, then it is possible to say that this science gained its specific momentum and interpretation under communist rule in the Polish People's Republic and in the whole Soviet bloc as well. So when we want to reassess the significances, hopes, and limits of cybernetics in general, it is perhaps useful to take a closer look at the relation between cybernetics and communism. But before I talk about cybernetics in the Polish People's Republic, I would like to say a word about the Polish romantic and liberal philosopher Bronisław Trentowski, who introduced the term cybernetics into the Polish language 100 years before cybernetics took the driver's seat with the publication of Norbert Wiener's famous work. Although Trentowski's understanding of cybernetics has substantially very little, if anything, to do with cybernetic thinking after Wiener, Trentowski's take on cybernetics is gaining importance today, especially with reference to the relation between political and social power and computational technology. So my talk on Polish cybernetics will ultimately consist of three parts. In the first part, I will discuss the meaning of cybernetics in the pre-cybernetic era, commenting on Bronisław Trentowski's project of political philosophy. Through this project, Trentowski tried to define the relation between philosophy and cybernetics, offering a dialectical interpretation of cybernetics with a nod to German Romantic philosophy. In the second part, I will discuss the cybernetic moment in the Polish People's Republic, commenting on the activities of the Polish Cybernetics Society and on the philosophical assumptions behind Oskar Lange's economic cybernetics, in which Lange tries to combine cybernetic thinking with dialectical materialism. And in the third part, I will tentatively try to suggest what we can actually do with this Polish adventure of cybernetics in the 19th and in the 20th centuries, discussing about what cybernetics for the 21st century might look like. Having said that, I will unfortunately not talk about Bronisław Lem and his Summa Technologia, a futurologist treatise on science and technology, originally published in 1962 and written in a kind of a cybernetic spirit at that time. As Joanna Żylińska has it in her introduction to the English translation of Lem's book, I quote, "Summa Technologiae has lost none of its intellectual vigor or critical significance," end quote. So it would be certainly interesting to link Lem's critical investigation into the entangled trajectories of biological evolution and technical evolution with the strand of thought going from Henri Bergson and Georges Canguilhem to Gilbert Simondon and Bernard Stiegler. No less interesting would be to reinterpret Lem's futurology in light of today's technological advancements in artificial intelligence and NBIC, as well as the limits of Lem's empirical approach to bio and technological phenomena in light of contemporary ecology. Such an attempt, however, would exceed the scope of my talk, which is more focused on the political and ideological dimensions of Polish cybernetics, both in the pre-cybernetic era and in the Cold War era. So let's start with Trentowski and the meaning of cybernetics 100 before Norbert Wiener. Trentowski is known for his attempt to build a national philosophy, especially through a contentious dialogue with German philosophy and a critique of its character that Trentowski found too speculative. This critique is undertaken in a strict relation to the geopolitical situation of Poland along the 19th century. As you may know, Poland did not exist as a political entity at that time. From the end of 18th century to 1918, the Polish territory was split between Prussia, the Habsburg monarchy, and Russia. I won't elaborate on this local historical context. Let me just focus on Trentowski's main political text, published in 1843, entitled The Relation of Philosophy to Cybernetics, or the Art of Governing a Nation. In this text, Trentowski identified cybernetics with political theory. He defined cybernetics as, I quote, "a difficult art of governing the nation." He also argued that, I quote again, philosophy relates to cybernetics in the field of politics as long as philosophy relates to theology in the field of religion, end quote. It is not Trentowski, however, who coined the term cybernetica, cybernetics in Polish. He borrowed this term from French physicist André-Marie Ampère, recognized as the founder of electrodynamics. Ampère used the neologism cybernetic, cybernetics in French in 1834 in his classification of sciences. By the way, Wiener will claim not to have known this political usage of the term as introduced by Ampère when he used this term for the first time in 1947. So Ampère meant by this term cybernetic, the art of government in general, and considered cybernetics in political terms as a part of his political theory. To a nation, he said, cybernetics is what strategy is to an army. And Trentowski takes over Ampère's idea and develops this idea within its own philosophical theory. Sorry, political philosophy. He reflects then on how to govern a nation, implicitly the Polish nation, on the basis of a new philosophical project. In Trentowski's view, this project was supposed to be distinguished from the German philosophical model of rationality, from Kant and Fichte to Schelling and Hegel. In this respect, Trentowski opposed French philosophy to German philosophy, arguing that the ideal of political and religious freedom was promoted by the French, not by the German. Of course, such a claim strictly related to the difficult geopolitical situation of Poland at that time has no meaning today, and seems to be nothing but worthless cliché. However, I am recalling this claim because it seems to explain why Trentowski refers to Ampère's cybernetics in order to discuss cybernetics in his own political theory. So, in this political theory, Trentowski basically distinguishes two political stances, radicalism and historism, arguing that they oppose to each other. What he calls historism seems to be much related to the specific current in the tradition of German philosophy called historismus, which considers human institutions such as state, language, and religion as subject to permanent change. In this respect, a radical stance in Trentowski's political theory would translate into revolutionary methods and would tend to the deification of the human self. On the contrary, a historist stance would be based on the belonging to a tradition. It would reject revolution and would come from the idea of a transcendental God. Trentowski's reasoning is classically dialectical. He argues that there is a constant contradiction between these two stances, which makes a constant progress possible. Put simply, radicalism as a thesis represents a tendency towards the future, it fosters new ideas, whether historism as an antithesis would be this conservative force which counters the change. If historism compels radicalism to give up the most obsolete, to give up new ideas going too far, radicalism remains progressive because it compels historism to give up the most obsolete ideas. Trentowski considers political philosophy in terms of a synthesis. The function of political philosophy, he suggests, would be to develop a critical look at the unilateralism related both to radicalism and historism. Neither radicalist nor historist, Trentowski seems to suggest that it is necessary to maneuver between these two extremities depending upon a given situation. Distinguishing between tyranny, aristocracy, republic, and constitutional monarchy in relation to the question of political freedom, he advocates for the constitutional monarchy where the ruler is not a tyrant, but someone who respects the people and is able to govern them, which amounts to deal with all parties disputing each other. It is precisely in this context that Trentowski introduces the term cybernetics. He uses the term cybernet, and in his view, the cybernet is a good ruler, not necessarily the king, but for example, a minister. Then cybernetics refers to a practical action depending upon circumstances, whereas philosophy would offer general principles. Put simply, Trentowski's political philosophy tends to work out a synthesis on a theoretical and conceptual level, taking into account radicalism and historism, whereas cybernetics would be something more pragmatic. It is supposed to deal within these two extremities as pertaining to real political conflicts. And because human reality is subject to perpetual change and constantly forms itself, to govern a nation amounts to act in a dynamic situation. This is why philosophy is necessary, Trentowski argues, as it offers concepts that make it possible to understand these dynamics. Discussing the function of cybernetics in relation to philosophy, Trentowski defines the cybernet as a birth attendant. One can say that cybernetics assists the formation of the nation, or in more general terms, the formation of the humanity. In a nutshell, the cybernet pragmatically helps bringing the best philosophical ideas to the political fore, whereas philosophy shows the space of possibilities and paves the way to the future. But this is not to say that philosophy prevails cybernetics, because cybernetics is responsible for making real decisions here and now, and in this respect, it is even more important than philosophy. Philosophy can and should show the best ways towards the future, but its role is not to exert the change. So, all in all, the relation between cybernetics and philosophy in Trentowski's political philosophy is dialectical too. If philosophy is a radical force, then cybernetics tends to contain this force and use it in a more pragmatic way, depending upon circumstances. The dialectical relation between cybernetics and philosophy was seen in an utterly different light in the Polish People's Republic. Now I'm going to the second part of my talk. Not only because the meaning of cybernetics drastically changed with Wiener, but also because the meaning of dialectics drastically changed with Marx and his dialectical materialism, which shaped Polish reality on intellectual, political, and ideological levels, sometimes related and sometimes unrelated to each other. It is very often repeated that cybernetics, as well as advancements in mathematics from the 30s, were firmly rejected by dialectical materialists of the Stalinist era in the Soviet Union. Still in 1954, the great Soviet encyclopedia described cybernetics as a pseudoscience. Nevertheless, the status of cybernetics radically changed after Stalin's death in 1953 and with the beginning of the Nikita Khrushchev's era. So far considered a heresy from the official Marxist-Leninist doctrine, cybernetics became a recognized scientific thought whose purpose was to optimize the centrally planned economy and to provide scientific socialism with a more solid theoretical background. It is under these historical circumstances that cybernetic thought is brought to the fore in the Poland People's Republic, both in scientific and political circles. Still in 1954, the Polish journal Philosophical Thought publishes dialogues on cybernetics, a 50-page article by three scholars, Henryk Graniewski included, a mathematician, logician, who had the initiative to found the Polish Cybernetics Society. Although the article in question is published in the section The Ideological Phase of Imperialism, its aim is actually to thoroughly assess the meaning of Wiener's book, rather than to denounce cybernetics as a bourgeois idealistic philosophy. If Wiener's contribution to the mathematical analysis of the process of automatic regulation is appreciated by the article's authors, they are rather reluctant to subscribe to a growing popular belief that cybernetics is a groundbreaking scientific theory with great philosophical implications. In turn, the authors admit that advancements in cybernetics in relation to the transmission of information and computer programming are compatible with Marxist conceptual apparatus and dialectical materialism. In his lecture delivered in 1964, titled Cybernetics and the Dialectic Materialism of Marx and Lenin, Gotthard Ginter points out that, I quote, there is no doubt that cybernetics has, since about 1960, arrived in Marxist countries in full splendor, end quote. So cybernetics were not considered a threat to the official philosophical doctrine, but on the contrary, it was considered an opportunity to re-examine certain positions of Marxist ideology from a different angle. Communist propaganda in the Polish People's Republic made of cybernetics a synonym for rationalization and techno-scientific progress. Whenever you go to Warsaw, you can waste your time and go to the former industrial area called Służewiec, where you can find some strange street names, such as Cybernetics Street, Computer Street, Progress Street, Rationalization Street, or Invention Street. All these streets were created in accordance with the so-called 6-year plan, and that is the centralized plan adopted in 1950 and concentrated on increasing the heavy industry sector in the Poland People's Republic. Incidentally, today, this area is the very symbol of how the total market got extended to the former Eastern Bloc. Former factories were replaced by the headquarters of transnational companies, and the area got transformed into one of the biggest office basins in Europe. Now, putting aside this ideological infatuation of Polish cybernetics, the cybernetic moment in the Polish People's Republic presents itself as a techno-scientific project based on a more or less concrete epistemology and involving many academics and engineers, particularly those who worked in technological universities at that time. As I already said, in 1962, the Polish Cybernetics Society is founded on the initiative of mathematician and logician Henryk Greniewski. The society has its branches in several Polish cities, and it counts more than 1,000 members. 10 years later, leading Polish scholars from different disciplines included. Curiously enough, a press note on the foundation of the Polish Cybernetics Society was published in New York Times in June 1962. And this note very clearly reveals all kinds of tensions, difficulties, and challenges that accompanied the entry of cybernetic thinking to Poland in the Cold War era. Let me quote this note. It is titled, "Cybernetics Society is formed in Poland in a policy reversal." A Polish Cybernetics Society was founded last week in Warsaw. In scientific circles, the event coinciding with the 10th anniversary of the Polish Academy of Sciences was regarded as a success of the progressive scientific spirit in Poland. As late as 1954, the Soviet encyclopedia described cybernetics as a pseudoscience. The spectacular development of data processing and computing techniques has persuaded communist authorities to take the new science seriously. But scholarly sources report that it is still treated gingerly in orthodox quarters. The same is said to be true of econometrics, the analysis and evaluation of mass data by means of special statistical methods and devices, and also of linear programming researchers and advanced sociological theory. The works of post-war Polish sociologists, heavily influenced by methods developed in the United States, are being translated and read in the Soviet Union, but they are not yet published there, according to authoritative informants. Economics and other social sciences are still regarded as sensitive subjects in Eastern Europe because they unavoidably touch on political matters. New ideas in these disciplines also disturb communist theorists who are expected to believe that the Marxist dialectic explains everything about human society. Professor Adam Schaff of Warsaw University, who is regarded as the voice of Polish science in top Communist Party circles, seeks to define the line between freedom and political responsibility for his colleagues. He has just published a criticism of what he calls the mania in Poland for poll-taking, market research, and other forms of modern sociological inquiry. 6 months ago, addressing communist sociologists in Prague, Professor Schaff said that as serious scientists, they had no choice but to make use of the new techniques developed in the West. In learned circles, Professor Schaff's seeming about-face was read as a warning that the present progressive mood in Polish science was cut-running its political possibilities. However, Władysław Bieńkowski, a former Minister of Education and once an intimate of Władysław Gomułka, the communist leader, responded with a stinging rebuttal. I quote, "Social practice is impossible without information," he wrote. He attacked, I quote again, "one-sided propaganda as archaic. Practical men need empirical information in order to act," he said. Bieńkowski concluded with the advice to some professors that it would be wiser to come to terms with sociology. However, Władysław Gomułka, the communist leader, sounded a different note. He said the Communist Party expected scientists to shape their research programs to the policies laid down at a central committee meeting in March, at which a big leap forward in industrial technology was demanded. Absolute priority must be given to the kind of research that plainly points to economic benefits, he said. So as you can see, all these tensions, difficulties, and challenges accompanied the emergence of cybernetics in Poland in the Cold War era. The quarterly titled Postępy cybernetyki, that is, the advancements in cybernetics, published by the Polish Cybernetics Society, this article talked about, beautifully illustrates this theoretical tension between the official Marxist dialectic and empirical research based on information and done with capitalist devices in communist reality. The first issue of this quarterly was published in 1978 up to 1993. And the aim of the quarterly, the advancements in cybernetics, as we can read in the editorial of the first issue, was, I quote, "to publish the results of theoretical research, experimental research, and theoretical experimental research in the field of technological, biological, medical, and social cybernetics. We also publish articles including thorough analysis related to issues of control, coordination, and management in physical, biological, medical, economic, sociological, and pedagogical processes," end quote. Nevertheless, the editors indicate that topics can be suggested either by the editorial committee or by the state institutions and authorities. In the opening article from the first issue of the quarterly, titled "Cybernetics as a Philosophy of Contemporary Existence," Edward Kowalczyk, a scientist working at the university and scientific worker specialized in cybernetics, who was the Minister of Communication at that time, says, I quote, "If anyone reflects on the development of human living conditions on Earth they must notice that with the growing number of the world's inhabitants, with the increase in social consciousness, and with the extended impact of economic activity on the natural environment, there is an urgent need to look at the ensemble of relations taking place in human society on a general scale. The necessity to ensure equal conditions for social existence, to use natural resources in a more rational way, to hold the process of environmental degradation, and to enable interpersonal relations on various scales of this problem, requires methods of thinking and acting that combine the so-called common sense, which is inherent to human being, with scientific problem solving and scientific tasks. Such methods are offered by cybernetics, end quote. So, as you can see, Polish cybernetics at that time had exactly the same thoughts related to the environmental degradation as we do now. And at the same time, they considered cybernetics a kind of a Promethean science in a typical modernist way. On the one hand, cybernetics is supposed to make the world better on many scales, especially through a better understanding of nature, as well as the so-called human nature. And on the other hand, it is supposed to make of science the rational basis and an intellectual justification for an ongoing industrial development. And there is, of course, a blatant internal contradiction between this theoretical stance, where one can read a certain idea of pre-sustainability, if you like, and a large-scale destruction of environment caused by the making of the heavy industrial infrastructure of scientific socialism. In fact, we mustn't forget that in terms of economic development and with regards to the exploitation of natural resources, scientific socialism amounts to some kind of a state capitalism where the idea of growth is not substantially different from the growth economy in market capitalism. Anyway, the development of cybernetics in Poland at that time was seen as something that could challenge this contradiction. Cybernetics is seen as the new fundamental knowledge which helps understand the complex relations between organisms, machines, and societies. There is a common belief among Polish cybernetists who call themselves cybernetics actually, that the role of their science will grow in the near future, and that cybernetics has a seminal role to play, especially in the context of the state's economy. Therefore, the aim is also to transform this new fundamental knowledge into practical applications by reinforcing the role of applied sciences. Science as a whole is seen as a productive force, as Henryk Kowalczyk points out in this editorial, and he does so as a minister and as a scientist at the same time. Under these particular circumstances, cybernetics as a theoretical and practical complex knowledge aims to change the understanding of the system and the making of the system. This is precisely where cybernetics tends to replace philosophy in its assumptions that cybernetics find too general. And this philosophical ambition which would be now supposedly based on the scientific exactitude and precision, is very strongly emphasized by Polish cybernetists, especially those who have no philosophical training. With time passing, it will very often give very surprising results, which seem to be more and more at odds with the realm of science. For instance, Marian Mazur specialized in electrothermics, the author of its own theory of autonomous systems and of the qualitative theory of information, seeks to explain the functioning of the psyche by offering a cybernetic typology of what he calls the character, and arguing that it is possible to put human characters in order according to their parameters. For him, cybernetics can be considered a psychology for the 21st century. Jan Trąbka, a neurologist who offered its own theory of cybernetic universalism in the 70s, and a very original neuropsychiatric explanation of consciousness, ends up with combining cybernetic thinking, gnosis, and chaos theory. All in all these strange drifts show that philosophical discussion about the meaning of cybernetics in the Polish People's Republic were extremely rich and stimulating, whereas cybernetic thought was very popular and created many discussions both on a scientific level and also on a more speculative level, if you like. Oskar Lange's take on cybernetics clearly stems from the original scientific spirit that led to the foundation of the Polish Cybernetics Society in 1962. Researcher in mathematical economics and a member of the Central Committee of the Polish United Workers' Party, Oskar Lange was actually the first president of the Polish Cybernetics Society. And I really recommend you that you have a quick look at his biography on the English Wikipedia page, because it's really interesting. Anyway, Lange is known for providing a model of market socialism, which was based on his theory of economic cybernetics. Unlike Friedrich Hayek, Lange argued that it was fully possible to monitor supply and demand in a centrally planned economy. In his book, Introduction to Economic Cybernetics, which is translated into English, originally published in 1965, Lange points out, I quote, "From the very onset of the development of the political economy, economists were engaged in problems which we define today as cybernetic problems. They were dealing with the processes of regulation and control of processes consisting of mutually related elements before such problems appeared in other fields of studies, in technology and biology, and long before they were formulated in general theoretical terms in a new science, cybernetics." Just as Hayek used the armamentarium of cognitive sciences to make the idea of the self-regulating market natural and universal, as it was recently shown by Matteo Pasquinelli, it can be argued that Lange used the armamentarium of cybernetics to develop a model of market socialism and to subscribe cybernetic thinking to the dialectical processes of development as discussed by dialectical materialism. Drawing upon what he calls the scientific socialism of Marx and Engels, as well as on Keynesian state-administrated capitalism, Lange rejects the idea of the market as a self-regulating system. He argues that, I quote, scientific socialism was the first to expand the principle of conscious management of social processes as its basic historical task, end quote. It is then possible to use the concepts such as regulation, management, and stability in different philosophical and political settings. In a nutshell, if Lange provides us with a very clear and convincing description of what a cybernetic system looks like and how it works, this description is grounded in dialectical materialism. Rather than discussing the relation between philosophy and cybernetics, as Trentowski did in the pre-cybernetic era, Lange actually offers its own philosophy of cybernetics reinterpreted with Marxist concepts. Central to Lange's approach is the question of the whole, and also the question of what dialectical processes of development look like. According to dialectical materialism, Lange says there are material systems and their elements are linked by cause and effect chains. The properties of these systems are distinguished from the properties of the elements they consist of. They also have their own regularities of operation that cannot be fully explained by the laws of operation of the elements. Lange defines these systems as wholes, explaining the philosophical assumptions behind his approach to economic cybernetics. He offers a wide range of the examples of such wholes. Chemical compounds in relation to the physical aggregates of elements, living matter in relation to physical and chemical systems, animal organisms in relation to individual cells of living matter, psychic processes in relation to the biological properties of the organism, and finally, the social formations in relation to biopsychological properties and regularities of human organisms. All changes within these wholes described from a cybernetic viewpoint have a dialectical character, according to Lange. Contradictions appear in a given system constituted as a whole, and their appearance causes a transformation which leads to the disappearance of the resulting contradictions. This transformation, however, breeds new contradictions, which consequently bring about a new transformation in and of the system. In a nutshell, the systems constituted as wholes are subject to permanent change. All these changes take place in a specific direction, which means that they constitute a development process. Specific wholes combine into more complex systems, and these systems acquire new properties, new qualities, and new regularities that they did not have before. Lange opposes this description of the system to what he calls finalism, that he identifies to metaphysics, and mechanism. He's opposed to finalism because he rejects the assumption that there must be a substantial factor which would be decisive for the direction of the development process. Life force, élan vital, the soul, the spirit of a nation, or the spirit of an epoch, can be, according to him, examples of such a substantial factor that might justify the fact that new properties and new regularities become higher. And when it comes to mechanism, he dismisses mechanism, arguing that mechanistic approaches to the system are unable to explain the properties and regularities of the whole, since they lay upon a belief that a whole is a simple sum of all parts it consists of. Put simply, if mechanism denies the existence of the wholes with their own properties and qualities, finalism tends to explain them by referring to entities whose existence cannot be proved empirically. Cybernetics offers a new conceptual apparatus that make it possible to overcome this philosophical difficulty and, in Lange's view, to elaborate a cogent approach to the whole in light of dialectical development. Now, to what an extent this materialist dialectical reading of cybernetics can be enlightening in the discussion about cybernetics for the 21st century. Let me quote Gotthard Günther again, who, responding to the West European of American or American scholar, points out, I quote, "It is true that dialectic materialism has been used as a tool by one of the most powerful political movements in history, but it is ludicrous to believe that it has been invented only to serve extraneous economic or social foes," end quote. Which means that serious Marxist scientists as Oskar Lange, in their constant attempt to deal with the complex relation between science and philosophy, did not try desperately and at all costs to subscribe cybernetics to dialectical materialism only because the ideological pressure made them do so. Even though this ideological pressure was certainly there, they sincerely believed that the basic assumptions of dialectical materialism, its ideological infatuation notwithstanding, cannot be dismissed by any scientific statement, because the theory of dialectics, as Günther has it, I quote again, is a higher logical order than any formal mathematical logic a particular scientific discipline may apply, end quote. So the real philosophical and scientific question in relation to cybernetics for the 21st century would be about to think anew the relation between the theory of dialectics and natural science, which would also mean to overcome the classic two-valued logic in the contemporary applications of computational technology. In this respect, Oskar Lange's attempt to combine cybernetics and dialectical materialism might serve as a starting point for further discussion. All in all, rather than about the political, economic, and ideological dimensions of dialectical materialism, the question is about the relation between the dialectical logic and cybernetic systems. To revisit this relation from within the artificial Earth system we inhabit means to address a new question about how to change the epistemology of the system rather than to change or escape the system itself. And in this respect, and perhaps quite surprisingly, Bronisław Trentowski's traditional or even conservative reading of dialectics in his pre-cybernetic approach to cybernetics might still be of use, to a certain extent at least. Putting aside his penchant to constitutional monarchy, which has no meaning today, Trentowski's take on cybernetics is useful because on the level of the history of ideas, it offers an account of the even more political significance of cybernetics when cybernetics, after Wiener, started to mean control and communication in all kinds of systems. Trentowski helps us rethink what happens when to govern and to control become interchangeable in a social reality potently shaped by more and more autonomous technology. What happens when technological regulation replaces legal regulation, when automation substitutes for autonomy? To discern semantically subtle, yet politically and socially crucial differences between to govern and to control, between autonomy and automation, between technological regulation and legal regulation, means perhaps to reopen a discussion on the relation between philosophy and cybernetics after the cybernetic spirit has penetrated many branches of contemporary engineering and got concretized in machines constituting today's technosphere. Here, Trentowski's pre-cybernetic understanding of cybernetics as the art of governance seems particularly interesting as a way to challenge the meaning and the limits of homeostasis, a concept which was central to the 20th century cybernetic discourse, but which was also central from a political viewpoint, especially in the context of governmentality, as famously described by Michel Foucault. For Foucault, as we know, the question was no more about how to govern a nation, which is a traditionally political question, but the question was about how to govern human population, which is already a biopolitical and technological question at the same time. Let me briefly recall that in his lectures at the Collège de France from 1975 to 1976, published in the book Society Must Be Defended, where Foucault discusses biopolitics in Western neoliberal society and defines biopolitics as the technology of power, he says that regulatory mechanisms inherent to this technology, I quote, must be established to establish an equilibrium, establish a sort of homeostasis, In a word, security mechanisms have to be installed around the random element inherent in a population of living beings so as to optimize a state of life, end quote. And later on, Foucault adds, I quote again, this is a technology which aims to establish a sort of homeostasis, not by training individuals, but by achieving an overall equilibrium that protects the security of the whole from internal dangers, end quote. So I cannot elaborate on how cybernetic concepts such as homeostasis became mere yet powerful metaphors in neoliberal ideology. Let me just flag up that it is through cybernetics, and more precisely through biocybernetics, which has got another lifetime with biotechnology in the 21st century, that neoliberalism could work as revolution and adaptation at the same time. Applied to society, the concept of homeostasis means a permanent rebalancing through feedback loops and various physiological components that one can observe in a living organism and that are now supposed to explain social mechanisms. A new reading of Trentowski's political take on cybernetics as the art of government beyond the idea of control is perhaps a good starting point for retrieving cybernetic thinking from its neoliberal interpretation and to ask how we could and should rethink the concept of governmentality in order to respond to a post-liberal, because totalitarian tendency that characterizes the technological becoming of our world. Obviously, this is not to go back to Trentowski's old-fashioned liberalism, but to ask about the epistemological limits of the 20th century cybernetics and its constant and somewhat naive ambition to explain how society works. I am compelled to say that it is a very slight hope. Norbert Wiener said, responding to a common belief shared by his followers, who hoped that cybernetics was the way to go in order to better understand humans and society. This is why it is perhaps useful to revisit the political meaning of cybernetics in pre-cybernetic era when asking about what cybernetics for the 21st century might look like, especially in political terms. Thank you for your attention.